The royal gardens of the Twilight Court were a place of legend. They existed in the perpetual dusk that characterized the Twilight Kingdom. Not quite day, not quite night, but a perfect balance between both. The flowers that bloomed here couldn't exist in either full light or full darkness. They required this precise equilibrium, this middle ground between extremes. And they were absolutely magnificent. King Aelindor walked through those gardens in the early hours of dusk, when the magical lights of the kingdom hadn't yet illuminated and the natural twilight was at its most perfect. He was alone, a rarity for someone of his status. Usually, he was surrounded by advisors, guards, courtiers, all seeking his attention, his favor, his approval. But today, he'd dismissed them all. Aelindor was ancient by Phi standards, nearly 5,000 years old, which meant he'd seen the rise and fall of human civilizations, the shifting of the boundaries between magical and mundane worlds, the slow evolution of Phi society from wild and chaotic to structured and formal. He'd been king of the Twilight Court for the last 2,000 years. And in that time, he'd established himself as one of the most powerful Phi monarchs in existence. His appearance reflected his power. He was tall, easily 7 feet in his natural form, with skin that seemed to hold twilight itself, shifting between pale lavender and deep purple depending on the light and his emotional state. His hair was silver, fine and ethereal, seeming to float even when there was no wind. His eyes were the most striking feature. They were the color of starlight, with pupils that were vertical slits like a predator's. And they held the intelligence and weariness of someone who'd lived for millennia. He wore the formal regalia of his position, clothing woven from light itself, colors that seemed to shift between visible and invisible, adorned with jewelry that had been crafted by the greatest artisans of the Phi realms. Every piece he wore screamed power and authority and absolute supremacy. And he was profoundly, utterly alone. He'd been mated once, centuries ago, to a Phi queen of exceptional strength, but she'd chosen to leave the Twilight Court and explore the mortal world, ultimately deciding that she was happier among humans than among her own kind. Aelindor had let her go without protest. Love, he'd learned, sometimes meant releasing the person you cared for to pursue their own happiness, even if that meant losing them forever. Since then, he'd resigned himself to solitude. He had his kingdom. He had his duty. Those were enough. Then he heard the singing. It was coming from deeper in the gardens, from a section that was typically reserved for the castle staff and lower-ranking Phi. Aelindor knew he shouldn't venture there. It was beneath the dignity of a king to frequent the servants' gardens. But the voice was unlike anything he'd heard in centuries. It was pure and haunting, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with something deep within his chest. He followed the sound. What he found was a female sitting among the night-blooming flowers, her hands deep in soil, coaxing a particularly stubborn bloom into opening. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, which was unusual even for lesser Phi. Her clothing was simple, barely more than rags, the standard wear of a court servant. Her hair was long and unbound, a deep green color that seemed to shift to blue in certain light, and it was tangled with bits of soil and leaves. She was absolutely unremarkable by Phi standards. Most lower-ranking Phi had lesser power, less refined features, weaker magical signatures. This female fit that description perfectly. She was the kind of servant that people walked past without noticing, the kind of presence that faded into the background of daily life. But when she sang, something in reality seemed to shift. Aelindor stepped forward, and a twig snapped beneath his feet. The female jerked upright, her hands leaving the soil. She turned toward him, and Aelindor saw her eyes for the first time. They were green, a deep forest green, but with something else in them. Something ancient and powerful and utterly at odds with her otherwise unremarkable appearance. For a moment, they stared at each other. Then the female dropped into a deep bow, her entire body trembling. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. I didn't know anyone was there. I was just. The roses needed help opening. And I was singing to the magic. And I didn't mean to." Quote, "What's your name?" Aelindor asked. His voice was deep, layered with centuries of authority, and the sound of it made the female tremble more intensely. "Lyra, Your Majesty," she said quickly. "I'm a servant in the gardens. Lower classification. I meant no disrespect." "You were singing to the magic," Aelindor said slowly. He could feel it now. Sense the way her voice had been tugging at the fundamental threads of the garden's magic. "The roses were responding to you. They always do," Lyra said. She kept her eyes down, refusing to meet his gaze. "All the plants do. I can feel what they need. And when I sing, they listen. It's nothing special, Your Majesty. Just a gift for flowers." But it wasn't nothing. Aelindor could sense it clearly. This unremarkable servant girl was radiating power so carefully suppressed, so deliberately hidden, that most Fae wouldn't even recognize it. She was like a supernova bound in a mortal body, all her brilliance compressed into invisibility. "Sing for me," he said. "Your Majesty?" Lyra looked up, shock in those forest green eyes. "Sing," Aelindor repeated. "The way you were singing before. I want to hear it." Lyra hesitated, clearly terrified of disobeying a direct royal command but equally terrified of actually complying. Finally, slowly, she began to sing. The melody was different this time. Sadder, more complex, carrying layers of emotion that Aelindor hadn't heard in the simple joy of the previous melody. As she sang, the entire garden seemed to respond. Flowers opened that hadn't bloomed in years. Vines climbed walls they'd never reached before. Water in the fountains began to glow with soft light. And Aelindor felt something shift inside him that he hadn't felt in centuries. Recognition, connection, the sense of meeting someone who was fundamentally important to his existence. When the song ended, Lyra was crying, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I shouldn't have sung so strongly. I lost control. I'm so sorry. Your Majesty, please don't have me punished. I'll leave the gardens. I'll request a different position. Please." Quote, "What is your bloodline?" Aelindor asked. "Lesser Fae," Lyra said immediately. "Lower classification. My parents were both of minimal power. I inherited their weakness. I'm nothing, Your Majesty. I'm just a gardener." But she was lying. Aelindor could smell the deception on her, could sense the suppression of her true nature. This female was not Lesser Fae. This female was something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist according to modern Fae classification systems. "I want you to come to the palace," Aelindor said. "Officially. Tomorrow. You'll work directly in the royal gardens. Answering to me personally." Horror flashed across Lyra's face. "Your Majesty, that's not appropriate. A lesser Fae can't work in the royal sections. It would upset the other courtiers. It would be seen as..." Quote, "As what?" Aelindor asked. "As a disruption to the established order? I am the established order, little gardener, and I want you in my gardens." He stepped closer, and Lyra's entire body went rigid with fear. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Come to the palace. Don't be late." Lyra spent the entire night questioning whether she should flee the kingdom. She lived in a small cottage at the edge of the servants' quarters. A space barely larger than a closet, filled with plants that she'd rescued from various places around the kingdom. Plants that others had deemed worthless or unsalvageable. In her cottage, surrounded by the greenery she loved, Lyra allowed herself to panic. The king knew. He'd seen her power, had recognized something in her that she'd spent her entire life hiding. And now he wanted her in the royal gardens, working directly under his supervision. It was a recipe for disaster. It was a death sentence. Because if the king looked closely, if he started asking questions, if he began investigating her bloodline, he would eventually discover the truth. And the truth would destroy everything. Lyra lay in bed that night, running her fingers through the vines that grew along her bedroom walls, and made a decision. She would go to the palace. She would serve the king. And she would be the most invisible, most forgettable servant he'd ever encountered. She would suppress her power so completely that even he would eventually forget he'd ever sensed anything remarkable about her. It was the safest strategy. It was also, she suspected, a complete lie, because something in his eyes, that ancient, searching stare, had recognized her in a way that no one else ever had. And she wasn't sure she wanted to be forgotten by him. The royal gardens occupied the entire eastern section of the palace complex. They were vast, covering hundreds of acres, with sections devoted to every possible type of magical plant. There were gardens that bloomed only at midnight, gardens that existed partially in the mortal world, gardens that required constant infusions of magic to survive. It was a living testament to the power and resources of the Twilight Court. And it was completely controlled by King Aelindor himself. Lyra arrived at dawn, as instructed, wearing her best servant's dress, which was still barely more than rags compared to the fine clothing worn by even the lowest-ranking palace servants. She was immediately directed to the king's personal chambers. That was wrong. Completely wrong. The king met with the gardening staff in the gardens themselves, or in the palace administration offices. He didn't meet with servants in his personal chambers. But Lyra had no choice. She followed the palace guide through corridors of living crystal, through passages that seemed to exist partially in other dimensions, until they reached a section of the palace that radiated pure power. The king's chambers were exactly what she expected. Massive, ornate, filled with the trappings of absolute authority. And standing in the center of them, dressed in more casual clothing than he'd worn the previous day, was King Aelindor himself. "Leave us," he commanded the guide. The guide bowed and retreated immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the order but not daring to question it. Lyra stood perfectly still, her head down, every muscle in her body tense with fear. "You're suppressing your power," Aelindor said without preamble. "I can feel it. You have magic bound so tightly inside yourself that you can barely move. How long have you been doing this?" Quote, "Since I was young, Your Majesty," Lyra said. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor. "It was necessary." "Why?" Aelindor asked. He moved closer, and Lyra heard him but didn't look up. "Why would a Fae choose to suppress their own magic?" Quote, "Because lesser Fae with power are targets," Lyra said quietly. "They're conscripted by powerful nobles, used for their abilities, drained until they're worthless. I watched my mother go through that. She had a small amount of power, enough to attract the attention of a noble household. By the time she died, she had almost nothing left. She'd given it all away." Aelindor was quiet for a long moment. "Look at me," he said. Lyra lifted her eyes slowly. When her gaze met his, she felt something shift. That same sense of recognition that had occurred the previous day in the gardens. But stronger this time. More undeniable. "I'm not going to use you," Aelindor said. "I'm going to protect you. But first, I need to understand what you actually are. Your aura suggests that you're far more powerful than any lower-ranking Fae I've ever encountered. Your suppression is so complete that most of the court wouldn't even sense you as magical. But I can feel you. And I need to know why." "I don't know what I am," Lyra said. It was the truth, or at least close enough. My bloodline is mixed. My parents were both lesser Phi. But somewhere further back, there's something else. Something that shouldn't be there. And it doesn't fit with who I'm supposed to be. Show me, Aelindor said. Release the suppression. Let me see your true self. I can't, Lyra said. Fear spiked through her. I lose control when I release it. I nearly destroyed my entire village when I was young. I swore I would never let it out again. Then I'll help you, Aelindor said. He extended his hand to her. Trust me, Lyra. Let me see who you really are. Lyra looked at his hand. At those long, elegant fingers that could command armies. That could reshape reality itself. Everything in her screamed that this was a trap. That trusting him would be the biggest mistake of her life. But she took his hand anyway. The moment their skin made contact, power erupted through her. It was like a dam breaking. Like centuries of suppression suddenly releasing all at once. Her form began to shift. Began to expand. Began to become something other than the small, unremarkable servant girl she'd pretended to be for so long. Her skin began to glow. Not with the gentle luminescence of typical Phi, but with an intensity that filled the entire chamber with light. Her hair began to shift colors, cycling through greens and blues and silvers, unable to settle on a single hue. Her form expanded, becoming taller, more substantial, more real. And then wings erupted from her back. Not the translucent, delicate wings of typical Phi, but something more substantial. They were made of living plant matter. Leaves and vines and flowers woven together. Constantly shifting and changing. Growing and blooming and dying in endless cycles. When the transformation was complete, Lyra was massive, nearly Aelindor's height, and radiating power so intense that it made the very air shimmer. And she was absolutely, heartbreakingly beautiful. This is what I am, she said. Her voice carried harmonics that human ears couldn't quite process. Layered with the sound of wind through ancient forests. A mistake. A contradiction. Phi and something else. Something that shouldn't be able to exist. I've spent my entire life hiding because I didn't know what else to do. Aelindor stared at her, and Lyra felt terror spike through her. He was going to reject her. He was going to call the guards. He was going to have her executed or exiled or... You're beautiful, he said softly. Lyra's breath caught. You're powerful and strange and absolutely unlike anything I've ever encountered, Aelindor continued. He reached out and touched the wings that sprouted from her back. And she felt the contact like electricity running through her entire form. And I want you to stay. Not as a servant. Not in the lesser gardens. I want you here. In the palace. Where I can understand what you are and who you're meant to become. That's not possible, Lyra whispered. A lower-ranking Phi can't be elevated to court status. It would upset the entire hierarchy. The nobility would reject it. Then they'll have to adjust, Aelindor said. He pulled her closer, and Lyra found herself wrapped in his arms. His warmth enveloping her. Because I'm not letting you go back to being invisible. Not when I've finally seen who you really are. The revelation of Lyra's true nature sent shockwaves through the entire Twilight Court. Aelindor presented her at the next court assembly. In her true form. With wings of living plants and skin that glowed with inner light. He made an announcement that she would be elevated from lower servant status to something entirely new. A position that didn't have a name because nothing like her had ever existed before. The nobility was outraged. Lower-ranking Phi didn't get elevated. The entire structure of Phi society depended on clear hierarchies. On unchangeable classifications. To elevate Lyra was to suggest that those hierarchies could be disrupted. That the order that had existed for millennia could be changed. But Aelindor was the king. And the king's word was absolute. There were formal challenges. Noble houses declared their opposition. Some even threatened to leave the Twilight Court entirely. But Aelindor stood firm. And more importantly, he made it clear through both words and demonstrations of power that anyone who continued to oppose Lyra would face his personal wrath. By the end of the first week, the opposition had largely faded into sullen acceptance. By the end of the first month, Lyra had become something unprecedented, a bridge between the nobility and the servant classes, a symbol of possibility for every lower-ranking Fae in the kingdom who'd been told they could never be anything more than what they were born as. And in the privacy of Aelindor's chambers, she and the king were falling in love. 3 months after her elevation, Lyra stood in the royal gardens with Aelindor, watching as the flowers responded to their combined presence. When they were together, the magic of the gardens became something different. Aelindor's ancient power, layered with centuries of experience and refinement, combined with Lyra's raw, primal connection to growing things. Together, they could make the gardens bloom in ways that had never been possible before. "I love you," Aelindor said. It was the first time he'd said it aloud, though Lyra had felt it through every interaction, every touch, every moment they spent together. "You can't," Lyra said. But there was no conviction in the words. "I'm still lesser Fae. I'm still barely classified as magical by the traditional system. I'm still, quote, remarkable," Aelindor interrupted. "You're remarkable in every way that matters. Your power, your beauty, your mind, all of it is extraordinary. And yes, I love you. Completely. Irreversibly." He took her hand, and Lyra felt the warmth of him, the solidness of him, the sense that this ancient king was real and present and choosing her. Deliberately and consciously. "Be my mate," he said. It wasn't a command or a request, it was an offering. A vulnerability. A choice made by someone who'd lived for thousands of years without letting anyone truly close. Not as a political maneuver or a social reform, but as something real, as two beings choosing to spend eternity together. "If I agree to that, it will solidify every noble's fear," Lyra said. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. "A king mating with a former servant. It will seem like proof that I've somehow manipulated you, that I've used magic to control you." Quote, "Let them think that," Aelindor said. "I don't care what the nobility thinks. I care about you. I care about building a future with you. I care about creating a world where power and worth aren't determined by bloodline but by character and ability." He pulled her close, and Lyra felt her wings wrap around him instinctively, creating a cocoon of living plants and magic around them. "I choose you," he said. "In front of the court. In front of the entire kingdom. For the rest of eternity. I choose you, Lyra. Please choose me back." "I choose you," Lyra said. "I choose you. And I choose us. And I choose to stop being afraid of who I am." The mating ceremony was the most scandalous event the Twilight Court had witnessed in centuries. Half the nobility refused to attend. Those who did come seemed to be there primarily to witness what they viewed as a catastrophic mistake. The ceremony itself was small and intimate, held in the royal gardens at twilight, with only those who truly supported the union present. Lyra wore a gown made of living vines and flowers, woven together by Fae artisans who'd worked through the night to create something that was simultaneously a traditional wedding dress and a celebration of her true nature. Aelindor wore formal robes that seemed to be made of pure twilight, shifting between visible and invisible. When they exchanged vows, the entire kingdom felt it. The magic of the mating bond, something unique to their particular combination of power and nature, created a ripple that spread across the entire Twilight Court. Every plant bloomed simultaneously. Every fountain began to glow. And for a moment, the constant twilight that characterized the kingdom brightened and deepened, cycling through every possible shade between complete darkness and pure light. It was beautiful and terrifying and absolutely unprecedented. 6 months into her mating, Lyra discovered she was pregnant. It should have been impossible. Lyra's hybrid nature made her incompatible with standard Phi reproduction. But she was a being of contradiction and synthesis. And apparently, that meant she could carry a child that shouldn't exist. A daughter, she told Aelindor one evening. Her hand on her belly. I can feel her. She's going to be something completely new. Something neither purely Phi nor purely lesser Phi, but a true synthesis of both bloodlines. Aelindor knelt beside her and placed his hand over hers, feeling the magic radiating from their unborn child. What will you call her? He asked. Alara, Lyra said without hesitation. Like the light, because she's going to illuminate things that have been hidden in darkness for too long. She's going to be what I never could be. Openly powerful, openly beautiful, openly herself without fear. Over the months of her pregnancy, Lyra's power continued to grow. The suppression that had once bound her so tightly had completely released. And her magic was flowing through her with increasing freedom. She could do things with plant magic that had never been possible before. She could communicate with ancient forests, could accelerate growth, could create hybrid plants that combined properties in ways that shouldn't have been possible. And Aelindor watched his mate transform. And he loved her more completely with each passing day. The birth was unlike any delivery the court had witnessed before. Lyra's hybrid nature meant that her pregnancy had taken longer than normal Phi pregnancies and shorter than human ones. The labor was intense but not agonizing, magical but not uncontrolled. And when Alara entered the world, the entire kingdom responded. Plants bloomed across every territory simultaneously. Water in every fountain turned the color of twilight, and the sky itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended between day and night, neither advancing nor retreating. Alara was perfect in ways that defied description. She had her mother's green eyes and her father's ancient wisdom. Her skin held both the subtle glow of Phi magic and the deeper, more primal luminescence of Lyra's hybrid nature. Her hair was a color that didn't have a name. It seemed to shift between all the colors of growing things, unable to settle on a single hue. And when she opened her eyes and looked at her parents, Aelindor felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in thousands of years. Hope, not just for himself, but for the entire kingdom, for the future, for the possibility that things could be different from how they'd always been. 5 years after their mating, Aelindor and Lyra stood in the royal gardens, watching their daughter play among the plants. Alara was extraordinary in every way. She had her mother's gift for communicating with growing things, combined with her father's intuitive understanding of the fundamental structure of magic. She was learning to shift between forms, sometimes appearing fully Phi like her father, sometimes appearing as a hybrid like her mother, sometimes appearing in a form that was uniquely her own. Do you regret it? Aelindor asked. Mating with me? Becoming a queen? Bearing a child that challenges everything the kingdom has ever believed about hierarchy and power? Quote, every moment before I met you, Lyra said. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arms around her, watching as their daughter taught a group of younger Phi children how to encourage stubborn plants to bloom. But not a single moment since. You saw me when I was trying to be invisible. You chose me when the entire court was telling you that you were making a terrible mistake. That's something I never thought I'd have. Aelindor pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her, a combination of earth and starlight, of ancient forests and twilight magic that was uniquely hers. I was choosing you before I even understood what you were, he said. Every century of my life was a path leading to the moment when an unremarkable servant girl started singing to the roses, and I finally understood why I'd been waiting for thousands of years. Why nothing had ever felt complete. Why I'd been alone, even surrounded by power and position and everything I was supposed to want. He turned her to face him. And he kissed her with all the tenderness and passion that came from truly seeing someone. From recognizing their soul and choosing them anyway. You were never supposed to be lesser, Phi, he said softly. You were always supposed to be exactly who you are. It just took me finding you in the gardens to understand it. Epilogue. 20 years later, Alara stood before the assembly of the Twilight Court, and the entire kingdom held its breath. At 25 years old, she was already reshaping the fundamental structure of Phi society. She'd proposed reforms that would eliminate the rigid classification system that had existed for millennia. She'd established schools where every Phi, regardless of their power level or bloodline, could learn to develop their gifts. She'd created trade networks with human kingdoms, demonstrating that cooperation between species could be beneficial for everyone. She was unprecedented. She was revolutionary. She was exactly what the kingdom had needed, even if most of the nobility hadn't known it. I come before you today, Alara announced, her voice carrying both her father's ancient authority and her mother's connection to something primal and real, to propose something radical, an end to the classification system that has divided our people for millennia. A new structure based not on bloodline or initial power level, but on what each individual Phi is capable of achieving when given the opportunity to grow. The nobility stirred with discomfort, but no one dared openly oppose. The young queen commanded respect, not just through her power, but through her wisdom and her genuine care for her people. My mother was classified as lesser Phi her entire life, Alara continued. But she was never lesser. She was simply unrecognized. She was hiding her true power because society told her that power in a lower-ranking Phi was dangerous. But what if we changed society instead? What if we created a world where every Phi could be fully themselves without fear? Quote. She paused, letting that vision sink in. My father chose to love someone that the entire kingdom told him was beneath him. And in doing so, he showed that love, true love, transcends hierarchy. I'm proposing that we build a kingdom based on that principle. A place where your worth isn't determined by how you were born, but by who you choose to become. Aelindor and Lyra watched from the royal stands, proud and awed by the daughter they'd created. Lyra had her hand on Aelindor's arm, and he could feel her power radiating contentment and joy. She's going to change everything, Lyra whispered. She already has, Aelindor said. He turned to look at his mate, at the woman who'd gone from being an invisible servant to being a queen who'd transformed an entire kingdom simply by being herself. The moment you sang in those gardens. The moment I recognized who you really were. The moment we chose each other. We changed the trajectory of the entire Phi world. Our daughter is just continuing what we started. As Alara continued her speech, as the assembly slowly began to understand the magnitude of what she was proposing, as the old structures of Phi society began to crack and reshape themselves into something new, Aelindor felt a sense of completion that transcended power, transcended immortality, transcended everything he'd believed possible. He'd been king for 2,000 years. He'd been lonely for most of that time. And then an unremarkable servant girl with extraordinary eyes had begun singing to roses. And everything had changed. Sometimes the greatest revolutions weren't started by the most powerful beings in existence. Sometimes they were started by someone willing to be themselves, truly and completely, despite a world telling them to hide. Sometimes they were started by love, the kind of love that transcended hierarchy and expectation. The kind that saw beyond surface appearances to the true essence of a being. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, if you were willing to see past tradition and embrace transformation, if you were willing to choose love over power, Sometimes you got to spend eternity building that love into something that changed the world. Nova's voice grew stronger as she spoke, and Aelindor listened with pride as his daughter outlined a vision of a Phi kingdom that had never existed before. One where bloodline didn't determine destiny. Where everyone had the opportunity to become their best self. Where love transcended hierarchy. This was their legacy. Not just a child, but a future. Not just a mating, but a transformation of everything the Phi world thought it knew about itself. And it had all begun in a garden. When a king recognized extraordinary power hidden beneath an ordinary disguise, and made the choice that changed everything.